I am professor of Russian history. I teach Russian history courses, and I direct the Russian Studies program and the MIT Russia program. My co-organizer is Carol Savitz, who is a senior research associate at the Security Studies program. And the real maker and shaker for this program is Michelle English, formerly Michelle Nusch, who is running us, who got this all organized for the STAR Forum. So welcome to the Trump-Putin Phenomenon with our amazing speakers, Julia Ioffe and Garry Kasparov. I'm going to make a couple of very quick announcements before we turn to our speakers, which is the most important thing. We've got a couple of interesting events coming up in CIS that were up on the screen before. We have a sign-up sheet outside. If you want more Russia-related events or more international studies events, do sign up for our mailing lists. Center for International Studies, the Security Studies program, and the MIT Russia program co-organizing this, and all three have very interesting speaker series. Quick announcement. On September 28th, Irina Prokhorova, the editor-in-chief of the New Literary Observer and a renowned cultural historian, will be speaking on Russian society at the turning point, new strategies in the struggle for democratic values. That talk will be at 5 p.m. on the September 28th in E40 496. On October 25th, Vladimir Kara-Murza, a very famous Russian dissident and opposition politician who has been much suffering under the Russian regime, will be speaking on showing his film Nemtsov about Boris Nemtsov, who was a not opposition politician initially, but eventually ended up being, of course, very critical of the regime, and who was murdered by whoever he was murdered by. That has not been solved. On October 25th, we'll show the film of Nemtsov, and Dr. Kara-Murza will be here to answer questions himself, another exciting event. And on November 13th, Mikhail Ziger, who is a very well-known journalist, the founder of the independent TV station Dozhd, will talk about his new book, The Empire Must Die, which is about the pre-revolutionary period, but I am certain he will talk about the current Russian events as well. So look forward to those events. We will have each of the speakers speak for 20 minutes, then we will have mics. We really insist that you keep your questions as questions, not comments. This is a wonderful audience. It's a big audience. Keep them to questions, okay? Let me say quick words. Julia Ioffe was born in Russia but raised in the United States. She's covered national security and foreign policy issues for The Atlantic, The New Republic, The New Yorker, Foreign Policy, Columbia Journalism Review, Politico, Washington Post, and actually many others. She was a history major. How many history majors do we have? At Princeton, and she's been fearlessly taking on and analyzing a wide range of complicated and controversial issues. Garry Kasparov almost needs no introduction. Russian chess grandmaster, former world chess champion, chairman of the Human Rights Foundation, writer, political activist. He's been involved in political parties, including founding several of them, Democratic Party of Russia in 1990, Russia's Choice in 1993, and in 2005, after he retired from chess, the United Civil Front. He's been very involved in working to preserve electoral democracy in Russia. In 2006, he and others formed together to create a coalition called Other Russia, Drugaya Rossiya, another opposition coalition. And in 2008, he successfully tried to run for president of Russia, but of course his candidacy was sidelined. His books, Winter is Coming and Deep Thinking, he will sign and will be sold at the event outside after this event. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Julia Ioffe. And let's give them a big welcome.
I'll awkwardly slide my chair around. All right. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you for having me. It's weird to be the first speaker because I'm going to give you a slightly more, probably an argument that you're not used to hearing. The American press, maybe not as much the American public, has been consumed with Russiagate, questions of collusion between the Russian government and the Trump administration, Russian cyber attacks, et cetera, and it's reached such a fever pitch that I want to just cut through the noise a little bit and talk to you about what actually happened and didn't happen and how we should look at this. So let's start with the report that came out on January 6th, 2017, when the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a document. It was a declassified report 2 weeks before Trump took the oath of office. And the conclusions that were pulled from the CIA, the NSA, the FBI were stunning. I quote, "We assess that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the US presidential election. Russia's goals were to undermine public faith in the US democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, and harm her electability and potential presidency. We further assess that Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump. We have high confidence in these judgments," end quote. In case it's not clear, this is an extraordinary series of statements. First of all, they're saying that a foreign power, a longtime adversary, Russia, interfered in our elections, and not just that, they did so with the goal of helping one candidate over the other. And what's also remarkable about this is that the often fractious territorial tribes inside the intelligence community were unanimous in these conclusions and reached them with high confidence. And when the report came out, it confirmed what a lot of us journalists and a lot of people in the Democratic Party had been suspecting and sometimes screaming about for at least 6 months. All those Twitter bots and false news reports floating around Facebook, the hack of the Democratic National Committee in the spring of 2016, WikiLeaks' perfectly timed email dumps. Now it was clear that it was all part of a coordinated covert influence operation run by America's greatest adversary, Vladimir Putin. They were not wrong. The Russian government did do all those things. But the DNI report raised as many questions as it answered. How did the Russians get so good so fast? Did they have help from people inside the Trump campaign or in the Republican Party? Were the Russian actions actually enough to change the outcome of the 2016 election? Did they, in fact, elect our president? And how did the intelligence agencies know what they know? And so the great Washington scandal machine cranked up in earnest. Committees, hearings, special prosecutors, leaks, searing hot breaking news, and an endless parade of talking heads on our television screens opining about Trump and Putin and Hillary Clinton and a cast of obscure Russian characters. If you're having a hard time keeping up or seeing straight, you're not alone. In fact, I am too. In fact, I wonder often if this is what 2002 felt like, when Washington was abuzz with news about Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction and Iraq and potential invasion. Because after a decade and a half of studying Russia, after a decade of living there and going back there for reporting trips, the narrative that I'm seeing in the American media just does not square with what I know, and it does not square with my instincts. The narrative we are now presented with goes something like this. Vladimir Putin, a cunning villain and strategic mastermind, driven by a personal hatred of Hillary Clinton, decided to defeat her in the 2016 presidential election and to elect his friend and vassal, Donald J. Trump. Trump is his vassal because Putin has compromat on Trump. This is a trendy new word now, compromat. And anything from girls in a Moscow hotel room, business loans, some kind of tape. So the narrative goes, Trump owes Putin big, which is why he's so damn nice to Putin. Can't say a bad word about him, praises him whenever he gets the chance. And what about all those Slavic wives he's collected over the years? Coincidence? I don't know. Anyway, so Putin, who is detail-oriented and excels at complex long-term strategic planning, lined all this up and maybe even convinced Trump to run against that old horrible hag. Then Putin, in close coordination with Trump, his campaign manager Paul Manafort, son-in-law Jared Kushner, and his son Donald Trump Jr. carefully orchestrated a well-organized and finely tuned disinformation and cyber warfare campaign to elect Trump so that he could lift sanctions. It's a very simplistic black and white narrative, and it just does not square with what I know of Russia or with my reporting. So if you've noticed, most of this narrative is driven by journalists and pundits present company excluded, who have little knowledge of Russia and how it works. As a result, the picture we get is garbled by misinterpretation. For example, earlier this week, Axios, a Washington media company, put out a report that a Russian political figure and pro-Putin hawk, Vyacheslav Nikonov, went on TV and admitted that Russia elected Trump, which is, you know, how historically covert influence campaigns are revealed on TV. Then there was the matter a couple weeks ago when the New York Times and the Washington Post broke a series of stories saying that Donald Trump and his men on the ground in Moscow, including his personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, were negotiating a real estate deal, or trying to negotiate a real estate deal in Moscow in the fall of 2015. And Michael Cohen wasn't getting anywhere. The Trump organization wasn't getting anywhere. So what he did was he emailed Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, and asked for help on this real estate deal. And people in Washington went absolutely insane. And they said, this is the most high-level contact between the Trump organization and the Kremlin. This is proof positive. We just blew the roof off the White House. To any of us who have been in Moscow, this is absurd. This would be like emailing Sarah Huckabee Sanders when you're trying to get to Ivanka. Moreover, Michael Cohen emailed Peskov at essentially press@kremlin.gov. He found the email on the website. Characterizing him as Putin's right-hand man, as some kind of high-level contact, it's madness. Anyway, much of the story is also not coming out of Moscow, if you notice. That ship does not leak. And local foreign correspondents there are kind of sick and tired of the story, would rather get on to what they think are more interesting things. So everything's coming from here. The leaks from the various congressional committees, from certain family members' lawyers, from our security services. And there's nothing to balance out the picture from the Russian side. So today I want to adjust the narrative a little bit and ditch the black and white color scheme and get into the shades of gray a little bit. I'm not going to make that joke. So let's start with what Putin wanted to accomplish. Personally, I think that he wanted to bloody Hillary Clinton's nose. So Putin is a former KGB guy, and like all former KGB guys and current FSB guys, they're all conspiracy theorists par excellence. They really believed that the establishment had it sewn up for Hillary Clinton, that her victory was guaranteed, much like his victory is guaranteed at home. And so he was just going to bloody her nose a little bit. He did not expect Donald Trump to win. And it certainly made America look foolish. It made the democracy look less than democratic, especially when you get the leaks of the DNC emails about Bernie Sanders, et cetera. And in part, that's for domestic consumption, because ever since the end of the Cold War, the 90s, when people in the Soviet Union and in the Soviet orbit in Eastern Europe were looking west, they wanted to be like the West. They wanted jeans, they wanted cars, they wanted McDonald's, they wanted Michael Jackson, and they wanted democracy. But it turned out democracy was really hard. So if you make it look impossible, unattainable, dirty, that it's not really democratic, that there's corruption everywhere, and if everybody's the same and everyone's equally bad, then why don't you play for your own team? Don't look toward the West, look toward the Kremlin. Let's talk about what Russia actually did. They conducted a successful, wide-ranging, multi-pronged covert influence campaign that included disinformation, cyber attacks, and well-timed leaks. But what's important to remember, and everybody who saw the intelligence in real time and afterwards will tell you, that this was a campaign that was highly opportunistic and improvised. It was, as one former Obama advisor told me, throwing spaghetti at the wall. They improvised as they went along. They didn't have this all written out ahead of time. And that gets to this idea that Putin is this grand master of strategy, that he's in any way a strategic thinker. Putin knows where he wants to go. He has the kind of 30,000-foot idea, which is basically make Russia great again and make America respect Russia. which he usually does by just demanding that we respect Russia. And then he has the first couple steps planned out. Everything in between kind of figures it out as he goes along. That makes him really good at outmaneuvering the US. It makes him really kind of deft, and the flexibility gives him power. But it also means that he's not very good at anticipating the consequences of those steps and blowback. So, for example, as I told you, the Russians believed that Clinton would get elected. And even then, it's, okay, you bloodied Hillary Clinton's nose. You believe she's going to become president. You didn't hide your tracks very well. And you kind of didn't hide your tracks on purpose. You wanted the Americans to know that you were able to do this, right? What the hell do you think is going to happen when Hillary Clinton becomes president? There's going to be hell to pay, right? Okay, they lucked out. She didn't become president. Russians were super happy. They're popping champagne all over Moscow. They're having inauguration watching parties right by the Kremlin. But then Trump can't lift sanctions. He can't give you back your spying compounds. He can't restore your diplomatic staff that Obama cut and took away in December 2016. And now the narrative in Russia is his hands are tied. His hands are tied by this vehemently anti-Russian foreign policy national security establishment. The Russians right now are really unhappy with how this turned out. Just when you hear people talking about how amazing Putin is at just planning everything, they are so pissed right now. Trump as a Manchurian candidate. This makes me crazy. Putin did not create Trump. We all know this. Trump was created by America. Trump is a very American phenomenon, and the ideology that he presented to the American people in 2016, one of isolationism, xenophobia, racism, capitalism on steroids, it was not this kind of populism. It's as American as apple pie. He was tapping into political traditions that are at least 100 years old. And as one former NSA director told me, covert actions don't create divisions on the ground. Covert actions exploit them, which is what happened here. Just try to think of when you look at this whole crazy conflagration, that political conflagration that 2016 created, think of Russia as the bellows rather than the logs or the fire itself. They're the ones fanning the flames. I think what also bothers me about this narrative is it obscures our role in 2016. The Russians actually did not vote. 60-some million people cast their ballots for Donald Trump, despite a dozen women accusing him of sexual assault, despite the racist, misogynistic, Islamophobic, xenophobic comments he made, despite his racist white supremacist followers, and his failure to denounce them, despite being the progenitor of the birther controversy, despite his constant lying, including about his success in business, despite not releasing his tax returns. I'm not going to take up 20 minutes with this. But the Russians didn't create that, and the Russians didn't make millions of Americans, tens of millions of Americans say, yeah, well, he's still better than her, despite all of that. And one thing the Russians certainly did not create is the racist backlash to the first African-American president. They didn't create the ginned-up Benghazi scandal or 30 years of negative coverage of Hillary Clinton. They didn't make Hillary Clinton have that stupid email server. They didn't make Comey open his mouth. They didn't create any of this. And by focusing on Russia exclusively as an answer to what happened in 2016, we are not looking in the mirror and asking how we're responsible for this, because mostly we're responsible for this. And we're also not talking about a system like the Electoral College, where 70,000 votes are more important than 3 million votes. And that actually makes us very vulnerable. It makes the system much easier to manipulate. If you can keep 300 people home in one part of Wisconsin, it doesn't matter, right, how many people come out and vote in the cities. That makes it, again, much more vulnerable. I also think that the way the media is reporting this is extremely harmful. Every new development just is reported like it just blew the case wide open, and Trump is going to be gone in a matter of days. It's not going to happen. We're stuck with this guy for the next 3.5 years, and we have to deal with it. People, when we report on this so hysterically, people burn out. They stop paying attention. I mean, I can't really read the news anymore, and if I can't and I work in the news, I can't imagine how all of you guys feel. And also, it provides the Trump administration cover for, you know, like a noisy cover for doing some really harmful, long-lasting things. Dismantling the EPA, packing the courts with radical but very young judges who will be with us for decades to come, rolling back regulations, changing DOJ sentencing guidelines, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing is, watch out for speculation in the press on Russiagate. There's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot of facts we don't have. There's a lot of theories, there's a lot of speculation, but there's a lot of things we don't know. Here are some questions I'm personally asking and trying to dig into. Was Trump a laundromat for dirty Russian money in New York? If so, how did that work? How much money went through his buildings? And are there corruption charges to be made? How did the Russian government, which used to barely understand the American political system, get so good at micro-targeting? How did they know what to do with the trove of information they found when they stumbled into the DCCC servers? This is the Democratic Committee to elect Democrats to the House of Representatives. How did they know which purple districts in Florida, for example, to target and to keep Democrats from flipping them to blue? Did they have help from the Trump campaign, somebody in the Republican Party, like a local political operative, or did they just do their homework? Did Trump obstruct the investigation? And the most important question is, did the Russians do such a good job that they changed the outcome of the election? That question ultimately is impossible to answer. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Elizabeth just mentioned 2 books that are available here. First is Winter is Coming. It's not about Game of Thrones. It's the subtitle tells you everything. It's Why Vladimir Putin and the Enemies of the Free World Must Be Stopped. That was released in 2015. And the last one this year release, Deep Thinking. It's quite ironic that while I was on a book tour promoting Winter is Coming, everybody wanted to talk about IBM, Deep Blue, and artificial intelligence. Now I released the book on artificial intelligence, and I'm here at MIT to talk about Putin. For many years, starting from 2005 and earlier, it's myself, my colleagues, including great Boris Nemtsov, we kept warning the world that Vladimir Putin was our problem, but eventually it will be everybody's problem. Just because we read some history books and we knew how it worked with dictatorships. They start with making some friends, so increasing their power, and they end up, all of them, by creating enemies, because they need enemies to justify the endless stay in power. And I remember that in May 2015, I was a guest at the Bill Maher show in LA, and I tried to raise the awareness about Putin's threat to this country and to the free world. And Bill was very dismissive. He kept telling me that, it's none of our concern. And he ended up saying, wake me up when he takes over Poland. I almost jumped on my chair, saying about 80 years ago, the similar attitude led to the greatest disaster in human history. Of course, after the elections 2016, Bill has changed his views, blaming Putin for everything, including stealing elections. And I couldn't help but teasing him, putting on my Twitter that it seemed that Putin decided to skip over Poland and went straight to Wisconsin. I'm addicted to numbers, and just looked at some numbers and found out that yesterday, Vladimir Putin has passed Brezhnev's record. 6,602 days in power. By the way, of course, I counted the 4 years where his puppet was sitting in his chair. But it's quite amazing. So in the 21st century, we have someone who is in power for 18 years and is going to stay there indefinitely. So the bad news, we don't know how long we'll stay. The good news, he also doesn't know. And as I said, he knows instinctively. I don't think he's too smart and he read many books, but instinctively, as someone who is in power for so long, he knows that right now there's only one way for him to prove him being worthy of power. It's to demonstrate that Russia is a besieged fortress. And he's a white knight defending Mother Russia against world's evil. Russian television for years is filled with America bashing. My mother, she turned 80, so she was born under Stalin. She still lives in Moscow, and she heard and saw everything, all sorts of Soviet propaganda. And she keeps telling me that it was never so bad and so depressing, because at least Soviet propaganda tried to sell you fake vision, but still bright future. Somewhere in the distant future, there will be communist brotherhood, we'll all be just good to each other. Putin's propaganda is different. It's more like cult of death. It's all about hatred, it's all about wars, it's about conflicts, and there's no bright future. He doesn't care about it. So that's why he needs enemies. And he's, by the way, quite good in creating them. Because he knows it is important. And now, I don't want to disagree with what I heard from Julia, because just, she's aiming at some of the stories that are being inflated by the press. But I think it's important to look actually at certain facts or certain omissions on Russian TV. It's not just some Putin's cronies, boasting that they elected Trump. But something just for you to chew on is that while Russian TV is, as I said, 24/7 is filled with anti-American propaganda, I never heard a single negative word about Donald Trump. Blaming deep state, CIA, NSA, you name it. Not a single negative word about Donald Trump. Maybe a coincidence, but just another one for us to understand that there were big expectations, maybe still some expectations, though I understand that Putin was quite disappointed because the result of these elections was not what he expected. I agree that I think Putin didn't have great expectations for Trump's victory. Probably they were looking for an argument against weakened Hillary Clinton administration, blaming them for rigged elections. And by the way, it's quite amazing when you follow Trump's campaign, you can always see the connection between what he said and what was eventually invented by Kremlin bots and Kremlin propaganda. So rigged elections was the biggest tag in the last couple of months. But he won, and then there were other opportunities that Putin wanted to exploit. I agree, Putin hasn't invented Trump. KGB doesn't invent their agents. They just look for them. They look for weak spots. And I guess that if you look for a KGB playbook or just any playbook of intelligence service, what are the top priorities for looking for a potential weak spot? Women, gambling, money. I think this candidate fit all three. Now, again, I don't know whether it's true or not, all these reports, and we'll definitely find out more. I think the Kremlin Gate will not go away. But again, it's important to actually see certain connections. And obviously, Trump was an ideal candidate that could be a counterpart in completing the grand bargain, which was the Putin's dream, because he just realized that it's not enough just to control everything in Russia. It's not enough to just influence the so-called near abroad, neighboring countries. After his invasion of Ukraine, which I have to say I predicted after his invasion of the Republic of Georgia in 2008, not because I had a magic crystal in front of me, but because I looked at the map. Putin realized that he would need something some kind of bargaining chips to negotiate with the free world. So he went to Syria. That was a big hope that he could actually bring Americans down to the negotiating table that could offset his actions in Ukraine. And of course, he stepped up his attacks about democracies, He did it in the neighboring countries, and then he moved beyond the perimeter of the former Soviet Union. His interference in the American election was not just an isolated accident. He has been trying to do it all over the place. You just look at almost every election, every referendum in Europe, and you can definitely find out that Putin had an interest, and he was not shy of trying to exercise this influence. And he had just a long streak of successes when you look at Brexit and the referendum in Holland in 2016 about affiliation with European Union with Ukraine, elections in Bulgaria, in Moldova, referendum in Italy. It's a pretty good record. And Putin realized that while Russia today is a pale shadow economically and militarily of the Soviet Union, he controls enough money, probably more than any other individual in the history of human race, so to buy favors and to run what they call hybrid wars to weaken the opponents. He's pretty good in clandestine operations because, let's not forget, he's not a military dictator. He's a KGB guy. And he plays his game. Actually, I agree with Julie's words about Putin not being a good chess player, because I'm sick and tired hearing, oh, Putin played chess and Obama played checkers. Yeah, I feel that I have to defend the integrity of my game. And the reason, to be serious, on a serious note, the reason why dictators don't play chess is quite simple. Chess is the 100% transparent game. You can see all the resources that your opponent can use against you, though you don't know his or her intentions, but it's open. Dictators hate transparency. They don't want to operate in this environment. So that's why I always think that Putin like a poker player. Because in poker you can win having a weak hand. If you're ready to bluff and to raise the stakes. And if you're just a good reader of opponent's mind, and let's give him credit, he's a good KGB agent. So, and you know that opponent, if you raise the stakes too high, opponent will fold his or her cards. So Putin keeps playing this geopolitical casino, and so far, you know, he at certain point he thought that he was doing it quite well. And also the chess analogy, this doesn't work because chess is a strategic game. And here we come to a very important point about the nature of Putin's dictatorship. It's not an ideological dictatorship. It's a one-man dictatorship, which is the most unstable and dangerous form of governance because it depends on the image of one man. And let me emphasize about the image of one man. When we look back to the Soviet Union under Brezhnev or even Khrushchev and Gorbachev, it was collective leadership, like in China today. I'm not saying anything nice about this form of government, but you know that if you have a bunch of mafiosos sitting in one room, they try to negotiate. It's not good, but you can expect them to be balanced because they always look for some kind of compromise. One-man dictatorship, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, it's all about one man, and Putin knows that he must look strong. Let me emphasize, look strong. And how he can look strong? Economy is crippled. The oil will never go back to $100 a barrel, so he will be running out of funds eventually, and he has to create some kind of environment where he can thrive. What it is? Chaos. And he's quite good in creating that. And he must defy the strongest opponents to look strong, himself. What is the strongest power in the world? The United States. So that's why defying US presidents, whether it was Obama or just now Trump administration, it's a very important element of Putin's game. And we just sometimes underestimate this is the PR game which Putin plays. And again, I have to give him credit for using this, and most of these things are for domestic consumption. You remember when Putin all of a sudden decided to go to General Assembly of the United Nations in New York in 2015? I remember that there was just a couple of days or just a day after the announcement, I got a call from Wall Street Journal that asked me to write an editorial about Putin's visit. I said, okay, fine, I can do tomorrow. I said, no, but he's coming a few days later. I said, but I know the outcome. Just why should I wait? It's not about Putin's speech. It's about the way he will present himself. And the most important moment was that there was not him speaking at the assembly. He didn't care about it. It was a meeting with Obama. Do you remember that? The moment when they met, and Obama tried to reach out, and Putin just took a few moments, just some kind of hesitance, and then eventually shook his hand. I bet you he spent hours in front of the mirror practicing that, because it was a very important element of propaganda in Moscow. What it showed to the ordinary Russians, the United Nations in New York, Putin had no choice but to go to the belly of the beast to meet Obama. And he didn't want to shake his hand, but he did. Next day, Russian planes bombed American-backed opposition in Syria. That tells you, everything. This is a story. Putin is very good in controlling this narrative. Maybe it's his team, it doesn't matter. But he understands the power of this presentation. That's how it works in Russia today. If you can follow Russian talk shows, they talk about everything. Actually, it's probably opposite to America. Here you can hardly find news about the rest of the world. In Russia, you can hardly find news about Russia. It's about everything. It's about Ukraine, Baltic states, Syria, America, not about Russia, because there's nothing to say about it. So and Putin keeps pushing these narratives. Now, going back to Trump's elections, is that I have been writing about Trump's danger from the very beginning of his campaign. I couldn't agree with Julia more that it's an American phenomenon. So again, Putin just utilized this opportunity that was given to him. I think now again, when we look at the whole stories, so I think I was correct saying at one point that Trump inner circle had more Russian connections than Aeroflot. But again, the good news is that Trump looks like an autocrat. He talks like autocrat. He walks like autocrat. He wishes being Vladimir Putin, but he cannot act like autocrat. Because unlike Russia, America's democracy is quite resilient. But what we found out here is that the many things that were taken for granted, they're just based on some sort of a code of honor. Because it never happened before, so we assume it's not going to happen now. As the two terms presidency just followed the Washington's tradition. So, and after FDR, they came up with an amendment. So Trump actually capitalized all these little cracks in the system. Everybody released their taxes. So what? Show me the piece of paper. I'm not violating the law. That's, by the way, classical trick of every would-be dictator. So they always look for an opportunity just not to violate the law instantly, and always just try to capitalize just by building brick by brick their own rule that could eventually overturn the rule of law. Putin was good at that, and luckily Trump tried, but I think he failed. And we'll find out more about his clandestine connections and his inner circle, being engaged with their counterparts in Russia. But what's important is that we already could see that his power is limited, and I was quite pleased to see that U.S. Congress limited his ability to interfere with foreign politics, especially in Russia, by passing the bill almost unanimously on Russian sanctions. I think I tweeted next day saying, it's non-magnificent 7, saying that only 7 people just were against it. So 3 in the House, 2 in the Senate, 1 in the White House, and 1 in Kremlin. And regarding Putin, so he will keep pushing, looking for these weak spots. And speaking about, by the way, the Russian word kompromat, that now just made its way to English language. Yes, I thought that we can look at the linguistic contribution of different Russian leaders into foreign languages. Khrushchev, Sputnik. Gorbachev, Perestroika. Putin, kompromat. And as I said, it's a mafia rule. That's why I always encourage people to read Mario Puzo's Godfather, because it tells you more about Putin's Russia than any other professional research. And Putin recognizes that as long as he looks strong, nobody will challenge him. Again, it's psychological. So even if we look back to Nazi Germany, the decisive attempt on Hitler was made after D-Day, after the invasion, on the opening of the Second Front, when the generals realized the war was over. So we haven't reached this point, and Putin is quite agile to make sure that he always creates new opportunities. I believe that the current crisis with North Korea is man-made crisis, because I wouldn't believe for a second that the wretched country with no economy and almost no science in less than 2 years could walk from very primitive nuclear technology to the H-bomb and a missile that could reach the United States. Again, create more problems, create chaos. And Putin is pretty good, and he always looks at the map for an opportunity. And again, compromised or not, it's going back to Trump. But in this case, I think we should assume the worst. It will be safer. Just again, of course, people say you're Russian, you're full of conspiracy. Yeah, yes, I am, yes. I always, as I say in my book, in Deep Thinking, yes, I'm a sore loser. Yeah, just, you better confess your sins, just people just to trust you. That is, I understand my shortcomings, but in this case, there's so much at stake that I would rather assume the worst. And again, there's so many elements in this picture that while I don't have any information outside of the public domain where I could read it and just collect it as you do, there's certain things that tell me that the story is just, it's a long way down the bottom, to the bottom of the well, where we'll find the truth. And for instance, let's take this infamous call of Michael Flynn to Russian ambassador on December the 29th, after Obama announced his decision to seize two diplomatic properties and also to send off 35 Russian spies, disguised as diplomats. Typically, during the Cold War, the response of the other side was simple and straightforward. The same, mirror. And by the way, nobody would say anything because that was a practice for decades. And Lavrov, let's just follow this, just is almost by hour. Lavrov said Russia would do that. Then all of a sudden, Vladimir Putin has overruled Lavrov, saying, no. Why don't we do that? So let's, invite the kids of these diplomats to a Christmas tree party in Kremlin. So what's happened? Again, dictator cannot afford to look weak. That's a sign of weakness, not to respond. And by the way, after recent events, Russia just, Putin was not shy to send off 750. Okay, many of them were actually Russians working there, but he could, reduce American diplomatic presence in Russia to bare bones. Again, the problem was not of reducing American presence there. I think the problem was that he got a call from Washington. The Russian ambassador informed him about conversations with Michael Flynn. Now, I don't know if Donald Trump knew about Michael Flynn calling Ambassador Kislyak. It doesn't matter. What is important is they trusted that Michael Flynn could speak on behalf of Donald Trump, promising that they would go back and just restore Russian diplomatic presence, and it could undermine their efforts to improve relations. So it means to me, and there's only one explanation, they have been working with Michael Flynn, they trusted him, and they believed that Trump would follow Flynn's recommendations. There's no other explanation. Again, we were lucky, it was recorded, and it ended up with Flynn just being fired in disgrace. And the grand bargain that has been, I believe, that has been prepared, I think Putin had a dream of doing it in Yalta. And imagine how easy it is to sell to Donald Trump. In Yalta, Putin will be like Stalin, you will be like FDR. Grand bargain, dividing the world. Who cares about all this? Estonia, Latvia, Bulgaria, we're here big guys making big deals. We decide the future of the world. Can you sell it to Trump? Something tells me you can. And now, just finishing my remarks, I think I can end up actually praising Donald Trump for winning elections. Because For many years, I heard here in this country and in Europe, it's not our problem. It's your problem, Russia, Korea, China. It's not a big deal. It's not going to happen here. Are you sure? Are you sure that democracy and freedom is not more than one generation away from extinction? Are you sure that you are not living under threat of a would-be dictator stealing power and just imposing his rule? Again, American democracy proved to be resilient, but it's very important to remember that it's nothing is carved in stone. And what Trump victory did for this country and for the world, it was a wake-up call. That's very important. People are getting engaged. And by the way, the good news from the other side of the Atlantic, it basically destroyed European alt-right. When just look at the results of the elections after Trump's victory, they all went downhill. Those that were on the rise, almost celebrating their imminent victories like Marine Le Pen in France, you can't find them anymore. And by the way, French election was another interesting story because Putin had smart bets. There were, out of 4 leading candidates, Macron, Fillon, Le Pen, and Mélenchon, Putin was betting on 3. Just 3, so this is the best bet. Far left, radical Mélenchon, Fillon, who was just in his pocket as Sarkozy, and of course Marine Le Pen, openly supported. And they lost. My reaction was that it seems Putin ran out of his trump cards. Yeah. And just to give another proof of this, of the importance of participation of the public, of our active engagement in politics, just another look at another European country, Holland. As I mentioned, in 2016, in March, there was a referendum. That was imposed, obviously, just by an outside force, because who cared in Holland about affiliation agreement with Ukraine? But in European Union, you need consensus. So that's why there was one country where there was a powerful political force, Geert Wilders, another alt-right movement, that all of a sudden decided to push the referendum idea. They won. 62% of the voters voted against it. It ended up that the government decided to ratify it anyway, but still, it was a big victory, and of course it was trumpeted by Putin as the will of Europeans just to go against imposed affiliation with Ukraine. Next year, everybody expected Geert Wilders to win the elections. Okay, in Holland there are many political parties, so he couldn't win outright majority, but everybody thought he would be it would be a leading party. He was I think there was a 4th or the 5th with a meager 14%. What was the difference? Simple. In 2016, 32% of Dutch voters came to the polling stations. In 2017, 81%. So that's the big lesson. And that's why I still have hope in representative democracy, and I believe that no matter how intricate is a conspiracy created by KGB, so we still should win.
Yeah, whatever, I don't know. So when Elizabeth and I were trying to structure our conversation, we decided that each of us would throw out one question to our speakers, and then we would open up the conversation to the audience. And there are mics in both aisles, so please, and make sure you ask a question and don't give a speech. So the two of you don't really disagree. I think there's a tremendous amount of overlap, but it brings me really to 2 questions. The first is, so what does Vladimir Putin do now? Donald Trump was elected. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but the backlash against what we know about Russian interference has certainly made it harder to craft that grand bargain, as one of you referred to it. So that's, where do you see Russian policy towards the United States going in the next year or so? The second question that it raises with me is, where are Putin's vulnerabilities? There's been some speculation among some Russian language pundits, et cetera, to say, well, Putin's really not as strong and the system's really not as strong as everybody seems to think it is. Where are his vulnerabilities? So I throw that out to both of you.
I think Putin's main vulnerability is that he's mortal and he's going to die at some point. And as Gary pointed out, that is the main, when you built a highly personalized, micromanaged system, your mortality is your main vulnerability. This is the core of the instability of the Russian regime. It is, I think it is a regime that is both fundamentally strong and fundamentally weak. It is weak because everything, how do I describe it? It's a very inefficient way to govern when you have a guy at the top giving a signal and then you have this bloated bureaucracy between him and that signal trickling down each step, and at each step people try to interpret what's going on, what he wanted, how do we overfulfill our assignment. So my favorite example of this was when he was running for president in 2012, and it was in the midst of massive pro-democracy protests. And there was a fear inside the Kremlin that Putin would be forced into a runoff. But you can't look weak. A national leader doesn't have to go to a second round. He wins outright. So that was the signal given. Putin has to win outright, deliver 51, 52%, make it look legit, and we can all move on. So the signal was given, it trickled down the bureaucratic pyramid, and on election night, it spit out 64%. And Putin, receiving the results, standing on Red Square, cried. Because the people overcame the State Department CIA-sponsored this is what Russian state media claimed, this wasn't actually true, overcame this fifth column rising up to defeat him and delivered this spectacular result. He is a pretty informationally isolated president. It is a system where people at the top drink their own Kool-Aid, which makes them very vulnerable. At the same time, they control the levers of power and the incentive structure. And so you still have a court system, a police system, you still have that is deeply loyal because they get fed by the system. And he still has a monopoly on violence and is trying to show that all the time. But I think I was just in Moscow in the spring, and the worry wasn't, so Russia has presidential elections coming up in 2018. And it's a foregone conclusion to everybody that Putin's gonna, right now he's being coy, he's like, I don't know if I'm gonna run. And everybody knows he's gonna run, he's gonna win, and he's gonna get another 6-year term, which is up in 2024. At that point, he'll be in his 70s. Now, 60% of Russian men don't live past 60. He's turning 65 in October. And as I mentioned, he's mortal. And so there's a lot of speculation and nervousness in the system in Russia right now about what happens in 2024. Do we do something with the Constitution so that he can come back for another 6-year term, but he's going to die anyway? And what if he dies? Who takes over? And can he even have an exit strategy? Can he have a successor he can trust who will guarantee his safety and all of his ill-gotten gains? He tried that with Dmitry Medvedev in 2008. In Putin's mind, he failed. He allowed the invasion of Libya and the horrible execution of Gaddafi. This was a video, I don't know, the video went all over the world and Putin was obsessed with it. He couldn't stop watching it because I think he personally related to Gaddafi's fate and is afraid of that. So he moved Medvedev aside and came back. So if you feel that you can't hand the system over to anybody, you can't trust anybody, after that he started filling gubernatorial slots with his former cooks and bodyguards. That's a problem. That's not a stable system. And that's a very long-winded answer.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We're all mortal, including dictators. The difference is they could be mortal all of a sudden. And Putin knows that. I don't think that 2024 is a big problem for Putin or for others in Russia. They understand that things might happen earlier because it's a big mistake to look at potential change in Russia based on the so-called electoral calendar. It's just a day for Putin to reappoint himself. Things will happen all of a sudden because the elite will lose faith in Putin. Now, what is Putin's strength? Simple. He was a protector of their interests. He allowed them to steal in Russia and to park their money elsewhere. Not in China, not in Iran, not in Venezuela, but in Côte d'Azur, in Marbella, in Spain, in Italy, and in this country. By the way, I'll be very curious to find out how much money was laundered through certain real estate empires. Because we know from all the books that real estate was always a most perfect way of laundering money. Not only for Putin, just for any other dictators and thugs around the world. And that's why Putin has been fighting, and the entire Russian machine, KGB, Foreign Office, fought Magnitsky Law. The law that actually aimed at, some people say, oh, just, second or third tier of Russian bureaucrats. Putin knows it doesn't matter. The mafia boss, the capo di tutti capi, must offer protection to every thug in his gang, to every hitman. Because this is the way it works. Full loyalty in exchange for full protection. If he's not there to protect their interest abroad, why they should be loyal to him there? And I think that is if Congress actually will push the full implementation of new sanctions that Trump unwillingly signed, which involves a full disclosure of these assets. And I believe American intelligence had pretty good idea where this money is being parked. Within the next 180 days, this is the biggest issue. Because as long as the Russian oligarchs, some of them are just stuck in Russia because they couldn't get their visa, but their families, their wives, their children can run, their empires from outside, inconvenience. Nobody's challenging brutal dictator out of inconvenience. But if their multi-billion fortunes are in danger, we should see if they will be still loyal to Putin or to their money. So there are many ways to make Putin not just to look weak, but actually to demonstrate this weakness that will be apparent.
That's another point, by the way, of another example. Gary's completely right. Of how the system is weak. When all of your elites, when none of their wives or their children live or grow up or go to school or get treated by local doctors, when they all live abroad. And when I was in Russia in the spring, I talked to a high-ranking member of Putin's party, and all he could talk about was how horrible life was in Paris. That's a problem. Like, even in the Soviet Union, the elites lived in the Soviet Union.
Or in the Eastern Bloc, they could go to the resorts, Eastern Bloc.
Right, but they lived at home.
Yes,
they were tied to the fate of the country in a way that Putin's elite is not.
Yeah.
They've already jumped ship.
So that's why my guess is that Putin will continue playing this geopolitical poker by raising the stakes. And North Korean nuclear crisis is a typical example. He would like to find any way to divert the attention of Americans and Europeans, and while creating crisis, to present himself as a peacemaker. So giving nuclear technology with one hand and waving the olive branch with another one. So that's the game. It's a simple game. You say, oh, it's primitive. Yes, but it did work. It did work for him, and he thinks that this is the best game that he can play. And unfortunately, when you look at the world map, there's too many places where he can continue this game by creating more problems and inflating the old conflicts that were somehow pacified.
But I think that's the key, that it's not that complicated. The Russians have this self-serving saying that you can't understand Russia with your mind. You can only kind of feel it. It's crap. Of course you can understand it. It's pretty simple, it's pretty primitive, and by over-intellectualizing it and over-analyzing it and seeing all these things that aren't there, we trip over our own feet. When in fact it's pretty easy. Putin creates conflicts and problems so that we can go to him to solve him. It's to solve them. He doesn't care about North Korea or Iran or Syria. He just wants us to talk to him as an equal. Right. That's it.
Absolutely, because that makes him look strong.
Let me also ask a quick question. Both of you have talked about the PR game, the ways in which Putin makes things look, and I'm curious what you think about his relationship to other dictators, the ways that certain machismo that he uses is also now being used by Erdogan, by other leaders. It seems to be there's kind of a plague of, let me show, and my favorite current Putin quote, I'm curious whether you have a comment on it, is when he said of Trump, he's not my bride, and likewise, I am neither his bride nor his bridegroom, on меня не невеста. And if you think about it, that this is the classic Russian way of saying, in fact, I am his groom and he is the bride. It's the belittling of the opponent. But I'm curious about that machismo and the way it has shown up in it's shown up in different variations in Berlusconi, in the Bulgarian premier, in Polish leaders, and Erdogan, I think, in some ways. So I'm just curious if you have a comment on that certain style of dictatorship.
Yeah, it's kind of the adolescent dream of masculinity. And in that, I don't think you need a pee-pee tape to explain why Trump is so drawn to Putin. I think it's the same reason that Putin likes Mike Tyson and Steven Seagal. It's kind of an adolescent understanding of what a man is and what masculine strength looks like. And Putin has, I think, a very similar goal. And as Gary said, he would love to run America the way that Putin runs Russia.
Yeah, I think it's not just about spreading the unfree world. So, by the way, when we look at the last, I think, 10 or 11 years, the reports of Freedom House, it's the number of people living in the free world has been steadily declining. It's amazing. 25 years after the end of the Cold War, we just,
we reproduce more slowly also.
But then talking about, it's about some countries like Turkey. That's 15 years ago, many of us expected Turkey eventually to become a member of the European Union. Now it's much closer to Russia. It's amazing. Who could have imagined that a NATO country would be buying Russian technology, military technology? So, but it's not. I think for Putin, every dictator it's another bargaining chip. I think his relations with Assad, it was a clear demonstration. Did he care about Russian military base? Yes, or naval base. Did he care about military contacts? Yes. But the most important thing was that Obama said Assad must go. Putin said,
Right.
That's right.
Where is Obama? Where is Assad? This is, it's a projection of strengths. And Putin is a great master of doing this. And Syria was a clear example. Message to everybody. That's why I think Kim Jong-un now is so arrogant, because Putin already proved, you stick with me, I'll not let you down.
And I don't think it's about that, but it's also, I think, about a response to American democracy promotion and policy of regime. Putin, to some extent, is fighting the last war, his war with George W. Bush, and democracy promotion, regime change. Assad was also about drawing a line in the sand and equating himself with Assad, saying you cannot say which leader stays and which leader goes. The people decide, i.e. the dictator decides if he stays or go. And when Putin talks about national sovereignty, he means that it is the inalienable right of the dictator to do whatever he wants with his people, his subjects, inside his own borders. And he will send planes and tanks and commandos to defend every dictator's right to do that, because he wants to defend his own right to do that. Mm-hmm. The reason he was obsessed with the way Gaddafi died is he fears that he could die that way. The reason he watched Saddam Hussein's execution on repeat was he was afraid that he would be put on trial and executed the same way. So it's personal to him.
Okay.
Yes, it is personal to him.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think we also should remember that all these decisions, sending troops, giving orders to sort of cross borders and carpet bombed innocent civilians, they have to be put in action by generals and by the officers. And while Putin, you may call him a kamikaze because he has nowhere to go. Political death for him means physical death. He knows that. So he'll stay in Kremlin. He's stuck there till the end of his life. But I'm not sure that many of his generals or colonels or majors, they have the same attitude. I'm not sure it's a good example, but remember that as the States, what happened when Erdogan decided to shoot Russian plane? How many times did Russia violate Turkish airspace afterwards? 0. It's good for Putin to shout, but then you have to give an order for someone to do it and to risk their own lives. And it seems to me that there will be very little appetite for in Russian Navy or in Russian army just to take this chance. So why did Putin stop his invasion of Ukraine? Not because he has changed his mind. By the way, that was a moment then when he had to cut his losses, because after annexation of Crimea, that went smoothly, which I believe, it was due to the fact that he has been preparing for a long time. So he promised to take over 10 Ukrainian regions, Novorossiya,
right.
all the way, from Lugansk to Odessa. He ended up with half of the 2 regions. Why, he decided to cut his losses? Because he just realized that he made a blunder expecting Russian-speaking Ukrainians to embrace his invasion troops. To the contrary, the majority, I would say the overwhelming majority of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, ethnic Russians, joined the Ukrainian army to defend against the invasion. And Putin realized that the cost, the body bags that will be sent back to Russia, it's too high. And again, he's a KGB dictator. He always looks for maximum effect to be achieved with minimum sacrifices. So he is quite good in measuring what he can invest in human lives and money to achieve his results. And he stopped wisely, recognizing that the war was not as popular as he thought, and it will be too costly.
And he didn't expect the Ukrainian army to fight as well as they
Yep.
did. He thought he would just sweep right
Yep.
on through to Odessa, and he didn't expect it to be as bloody as it was. The other reason about the other dictators, he doesn't necessarily need Orban in Hungary or Erdogan. He did really great with Schroeder when he was in Germany and Berlusconi in Italy. With Sarkozy, with Berlusconi, who taught him all about the wonders of plastic surgery. I'm not kidding. This is why Putin also saw potential in Trump. He does well with people who are like him, who are absolutely cynical, unideological, and are willing to bargain. And I think that all of these leaders share that trait.
Great. Okay, let's open it up for the floor. Why don't we start with this gentleman here?
For Ms. Yoff, do you think the US has ever interfered in domestic Russian or even Soviet politics? And for Mr. Kasparov, do you think the US should interfere going forwards given the threat of Putin?
I think thank you for your question. It's a very good one. From the Russian perspective, they're just giving as good as they've gotten from the Americans. So from the Russian perspective, things like the National Endowment for Democracy, George Soros's Open Society, all these NGOs like Golis that count ballots and make sure there's no voter fraud, that this is America influencing Russian domestic politics, which is why one of the first things that the Kremlin did after Putin came back to the presidency in 2012 is cut off the flow of American government and European government funds to these NGOs because they see them as interfering in Russian elections. I'm not saying that's what's actually happening. I'm giving you the Russian.
3 times you said Russian, and I strongly disagree. Kremlin.
Okay.
I'm also Russian. And we didn't believe America was interfering. I didn't know about America, CIA, NSA, you name it, trying to actually foster our movement. We walked on the Moscow streets, St. Petersburg streets. There were peaceful rallies. By the way, not a glimpse of violence, not a single broken window. So all the violence came from the riot police, and it was our, domestic movement. And of course, in Putin's eyes, any kind of support of human rights organizations or others like Golos, that was interference. By the way, they had nothing to do with our movement. It says when you look at the political movement, it was not connected to these human rights organizations. So that's why all we did there was based on the local support that we could get. And to the contrary, by the way, I can tell you that one of the reasons that we couldn't rally enough people in 2006, 2007, because Putin played this brilliant game. Garry Kasparov, Boris Nemtsov, you name it, many of us said Putin was already on the way of dictatorship. Really. And then all Russians could see a big TV picture. Putin presiding over G8 with Bush 43, with, I think it was still Blair, Merkel already, Chirac. So how can you trust these guys who are just crying in the desert that Putin could be a dictator when he was chairing the meeting of the leading democratic nations? So Putin knew how to play this game. So as long as it fit his agenda, he was very friendly with Americans, with Europeans, and as Julia pointed out, he was never shy of buying favors. And I think the infiltration of Russian influence through these kind of clandestine operations was never as powerful, even at the probably height of the years of Comintern.
All right. So we're getting lots of questions. Let's take 2 on this side, and then we'll take 2 on that side.
Right.
Well, I was going to ask another question, but I think I'll follow up on that one. The United States has not just interfered in Russia, it's been interfering in the inner affairs of countries around the world for decades, going back at least to the overthrow of the democratic government of Mossadegh in Iran, the next year Arbenz in Guatemala, multiple attempts to assassinate Castro, assassination
What's
by
the
Allende.
question? We've got a lot of people.
So yeah, you're right, we can go on all night about United States interference in other countries' affairs. So what's the real problem here? Is it that one country allegedly interferes in another country's elections or inner domestic affairs, or is it that one country interferes in American domestic electoral affairs?
So it sounds like the premise of your question, though, is that electoral interference in another country's elections is a bad thing, right?
No, my question is double standards, hypocrisy, and can one nation that's always interfering in another country's inner affairs criticize when they themselves are interfered with allegedly? I will stress the allegedly.
Okay.
In other words, what goes around comes around, doesn't it?
Okay, next question on this side, please, because we're going to do 2 at a time.
So
Is it left unanswered?
No, you guys have time to answer both this question and the next one, just because we won't hear all the questions. That's the idea anyway.
okay, so working under the premise that Putin is a domestic and global problem, I find that waiting for Putin's death is an unsatisfying solution, and I find that prying away the oligarchs is an insufficient solution. So how does the civil society in Russia and the Russian people, how do they move forward in the presence and absence of Putin?
So see if you could take both questions in one.
Yeah, first of all, I strongly reject, denounce any moral equivalence between the free world and communist dictatorships. It's appalling to hear the statements from people who grew up in the free world and they don't know what is KGB, or maybe know from the books. One of the reasons I never criticized American invasion of Iraq, which I think was a mistake, but I believe it's for me, it was impossible since it toppled a dictator. As someone who grew up in the Soviet Union, in the communist dictatorship, I couldn't criticize any action that led to the end of dictatorship, though understanding that many bad things could happen afterwards, but still, there's always choice of a lesser evil. And talking about this is American interference in other countries in the world, we can open a big debate. But let me tell you one thing. When you look at the political map 40 years ago, just look again, have a hard look, and you find out that every so-called right-wing dictatorship, whether it's Chile, Colombia, Spain, Portugal, Taiwan, South Korea, has been peacefully, South Africa, transformed into market economy and democracy. Not a single communist dictatorship has been peacefully transformed in a market economy and democracy. People are still suffering there. So that's why I think it's just the whole idea of just, we can compare Putin's actions or Saddam Hussein's actions with actions of US presidents. For me, it's preposterous.
I'll answer the other question. I think that you've hit on a very big problem. Russian civil society is kind of on the run and pushed underground. And that's not a good thing because it is hard for it to gather strength, and it also radicalizes the civil society. You saw that, for example, in Russia leading up to, in the years between 1905 and 1917, when a more kind of peaceful, moderate revolution failed, and the state reacted with more and more harsh draconian measures, both sides, both the people in power and the people out of power in the streets became radicalized, and you get 1917. The other issue is the issue of the collective, so-called collective Putin. In the US, we get fall into the trap of thinking that if we decapitate these regimes, that the next day they will all become democracies. Democracy is really hard work. It takes generations of education and vigilance and civic activism. And if for generations you have been, you know, at the point of a gun or a bayonet, have been taught to be passive and to not question authority and to not stick your neck out and to not risk things, it's going to be hard, even if the guy at the top is removed or his inner circle is removed. You still have 143 million people who have been conditioned for generations to be undemocratic. So just removing these guys and waiting for Putin to die, you're right, is not the solution. I keep coming back to something that one of Putin's advisors once said to me. And this is what happens when you, I think, or what could happen when you're waiting just to pry the elite off of Putin or to splinter them. He said, look, when this system falls, he by the way, helped Putin get elected his first time in 2000. He said, when this system falls, it's going to fall in one day. But the system that replaces it will be exactly the same. And that's the danger.
Just make a comment as this. I'm not sure that we should buy the theory of kind of genetic determination. Those nations.
It's not genetic. It's
yeah,
educational.
It's educational, maybe. This is but we have other examples of the 20th century that tell you it's not fait accompli. I agree, there's a danger. Unless Russia goes through the process of reconciliation with its past. Unless we go through our own Nuremberg, condemning the crimes of communism and banning KGB and having the proper illustration, so nothing will happen. So it's very important to do what's happened in similar situations in other countries. Of course, the magnitude is much bigger because maybe it's not doable. So, but I just mentioned. Let's look at the Korean Peninsula. It's the same nation. In 1953, they were divided after the end of the war. And they were just, the same people, brothers and sisters, the same GDP. So the only difference was that one was controlled by communists, another one was under American patronage. Now you have two Koreas that are just far apart. They're just like, two different solar systems. One is just the biggest gulag in the world. Another one is probably the most efficient market economy and very strong democracy, where president is being impeached and the head of the largest corporation imprisoned. So and it's the same people. So I think it takes time, but it's not it's not the end of the world. So and I believe that Russia had more democratic traditions than Korea in 1953, and we have a lot of Russians who live by the way outside of Russia now, and I think. There's a chance. There is a fair chance. There's no guarantee. Chance that we can just go back to family of civilized nations.
I'm not saying there's a zero chance, but I think to follow your analogy with Korea, I keep looking at North Korea and thinking, okay, let's say we take out Kim Jong-un and get rid of this regime. It's going to be an unbelievable task to rehabilitate these people that have lived under this regime for generations. And you look at Eastern Europe, and it was a foreign occupation in Eastern Europe. They had Soviet power for much less time than the Russians, and they're still much better than the Russians. They're doing much better, but they're still dealing with these ghosts and these problems that they learn.
So what?
I'm not saying it's predetermined, but it's a problem.
I'm saying
that it's a problem.
It is a problem, but you have 20 people, just living in the largest concentration camp in the world. So, yes, there are problems of integrating in a normal life, but it's not a reason to say you shouldn't do that.
I didn't say it was
Sooner
the
you
reason.
remove Kim Jong-un out of power, better the chances that you can save millions of these lives that otherwise will be sacrificed for his paranoid dreams.
I'm not saying you should or shouldn't. I'm just outlining the array of problems. I'm a journalist. I'm not a policy person.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm a human being.
Questions from this side, please.
So piggybacking off of this question of what is to be done, I think a lot of observers of the American election, and specifically the Democratic primary, observe that in the US we seem to have a lack of a unified left, or even a lack of a unified opposition. And then that was especially visible during the general election. So over the last 10 years, we've seen Navalny, we've seen Yabloko, we've seen the Progress Party in Russia, we've seen your presidential campaign. And it doesn't seem like we're that far removed from what the situation was 10 years ago in Russia in terms of who's in power. So what I'm curious about is whether you see a future for a unified Russian left, or at least a unified Russian opposition, and whether or not you think that's even relevant to standing against Putin.
Well, okay.
We should do two at a time.
Hi, I have a very different type of a question. So Ms. Eoff mentioned that we should view the American election result as a combination of several factors, which includes like influence of Russia and also the role of American people. So my question is I'm very curious to know what's your take on the role of social media, which has presumably acted as a catalyst in spreading misinformation, and also from now on, how should people take social media and what's the role of, how should people deal with social media and misinformation that goes around?
Yeah, I think it's asking the same question about time and again about what opposition Russia can do. It ignores the fact that Russia is the one-man dictatorship that openly embraces fascist ideology. Anything that happens in Russia is under Kremlin's control. If any opposition action takes place, it's because Kremlin believes that it probably serves its purpose for some reasons. So there's no way that you can go back to 2007, 2008, or even 2011, 2012, when we had massive rallies in the streets. It's over. They just, they destroyed it completely and they control it. So the only way for things to change in Russia, as was in the Soviet Union, is for regime to be weak, and we're talking about a geopolitical disaster, which doesn't mean, it's the end of war. So I remember that in my opinion, one of the most important events that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union was the Soviet loss of the war in Afghanistan. Just remember, in February 1989, the Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan. By the way, it was not a stampede, as Americans from Saigon. The war technically was not lost, because the Soviets could keep Najibullah regime, the pro-Soviet regime, for another 3 years there, I think 2.5 years. So again, technically speaking, they left Afghanistan with honors. But psychologically, to watch Soviet troops crossing the border, going back, had a huge effect in Eastern Europe, in the Baltic then republics, and across the Soviet Union. And by the end of the year, that year 1989, the Eastern Europe was gone. In less than 3 years, the Soviet Union was gone. Again, it's all about people believing that empire, the dictatorship, is weak. And as long as it looks strong, nothing will happen. But if they realize that regime is no longer as strong as it used to be, they'll fill the streets. The reason people are not there because they're afraid. It was, there were only 5,000 people marching in Moscow. Look, here in New York or in Paris, you had 1 million people, yes, but here police protects you. That's a difference. And I was always amazed to see thousands of people rallying in Moscow streets, knowing that they could be beaten, they could be arrested, and even worse. So, but now you cannot blame them for not doing that because they know.
Doing it.
That's again, it's nothing that you can compare to 2011. So that maybe a few thousand here and there, still it's quite heroic efforts, but they are too minor, and Kremlin totally controls the situation in Moscow and elsewhere.
I would argue they're more widespread, though. In 2011, it was just Moscow and St. Petersburg. Now they're in over 90 cities in Russia. They're still small. They're under, they're very vulnerable, et cetera.
It's young generation, and that brings us back to the next question about social media. So Putin, unlike China, Putin doesn't boast firewalls, but the Russian criminal code has sort of a new article almost every day, punishing people for even reposting some what Kremlin believes, anti-government rants, or even
Liking.
Well, yes, even pictures. So, and the role of social media, as I say, it's there. So it's the most powerful tool, and it's quite an irony that Putin and other regimes, dictators in the world, they know how to utilize the tools invented in the free world to undermine the very foundation of democracy. What an irony.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, two questions on this side, please.
I know that in Russia, there are parties to the right of United Russia, and there are ultranationalists like Alexander Dugin, the fascist guy who wrote Foundations of Geopolitics. So do you view these people who, they want to expand the Russian Empire, take over Latvia and so on, as this sort of irrelevant fringe, or are they people who are behind Putin and animating his policy? So should we basically ignore the ultra-nationalist Russian right, or should we pay attention to them? And what is their connection to this entire situation?
Okay, next question. Trying to accommodate as many people as possible. We're at the end of our time, so.
Just quick. I think it's hard to ascertain the validity of polls or elections out of Russia, and I'm just curious, is Putin truly that popular within the average Russian? Whether or not it's because he's strong and promotes a strong Russia, but does he truly have a significant portion, over 50% of the population? And a second part, which might sound like a little bit of a joke, but I think it speaks to the context of Putin's objectiveness. Do you think Putin truly believes that he's capable of scoring 5 goals against international caliber hockey players? I mean, do you think he really believes that, that was him?
He doesn't. I've heard people have seen him when he invited then Secretary of Kerry to play hockey against him. He then made jokes that people let him score goals. About his popularity in the polls, that's a very good question. And the polls, in short, are not accurate. Russian pollsters complain of very low answer rates on polls, and that it's a self-selecting crew. So if you don't agree, you're going to not want to stick your neck out and talk to people you don't know about how you don't like Putin. And if you do agree, if you like him, you're happy to share your opinion. So that skews things. Also, because there's been no alternatives to Putin for so long, he's popular just because he lacks alternatives. So it's a kind of very passive popularity. After the Crimean bump, which was a very active popularity. As for the young man who asked about the right wing, I think we do, great question, I think we do need to pay attention to it. Putin is not an ideological guy. He will use whatever ideology he needs to further his goals. He has a utilitarian approach to ideology. So for a while, Dugin was in favor during the invasion of Ukraine, for example, during this kind of amping up of Russian nationalism and jingoism at home. He has since been sidelined. He has been fired from several jobs and is kind of back on the margins again. So if it serves his goals, he'll use it, and as soon as he feels it doesn't serve his goals, he'll find a new ideology.
Yes, you're right. He's been fired because he was not radical enough. I remember we had this debate 10 years ago with some of the other liberals from Russia saying, oh, Putin was our only hope to prevent Russian fascism. My argument was, and many from our side, was Putin would end up as embracing this ideology because that's what happened with every dictator. And yes, just, the simple, straightforward views of Dugin, not enough. When you look at the current situation in Russia, it's those people that are much worse. The worst kind of reactionary that comes from the Orthodox Church. People are actually burning cinemas because they showed a movie about Tsar Nicholas, by the way, produced by a very pro-Putin producer. Somebody who signed a letter supporting annexation of Crimea. The state paid for this movie. But again, it's what's happening within the regime. It's like a negative genetic selection. It goes down the ladder. So, and Dugin is not radical enough. That's happening in every regime. So that's why, again, I wouldn't say that Dugin is a problem. The problem is Putin. The problem is the regime will use whatever is available, and at the end of the day, it will use the worst that it can find, because they just, by trying to keep this anti-American, anti-Western, anti-liberal hysteria, they have to look for they have to go just to the very bottom, searching to the bottom.
6:30, what should we do? We should end? Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
by the way, about the Putin's popularity, if you have one restaurant in town serving one dish, it's popular by definition. Especially if every other restaurant being open is burned down to the ground.
Yeah. So I apologize to the people who did not get a chance to ask their questions. I think we all have to thank our speakers today. Thank you all for coming.